The house did not echo until that afternoon. It used to hum with ordinary noise, washing machine spin, cupboard thud, pencil scratching on homework, but the quiet that followed my wife's announcement sounded like a verdict a hallway too late. Upstairs, a half-opened suitcase fed on folded shirts the way a tide eats footprints. Downstairs, the clock rehearsed certainty with every click, while my own certainty fractured. A child's laughter once bubbled in these rooms, now it hid in corners with the dust. I stared at the front door as if staring could slow a clock, wondering when love had begun to require proof stamped by a system that had no memory of bedtime stories. I became a father the day I started learning to tie a different pair of shoes. The shoes were pink with a scuffed toe and glitter that refused to surrender even after 6 laundry cycles. Their owner arrived 3 years earlier than I did, a small hurricane with serious eyes named Layla. When I married Nora, I promised to hold our home steady. The vow was simple and heavy, like a river stone in the palm. Holding steady meant finding the rhythm of school drop-offs and library Saturdays, learning which cereal stayed crunchy and which soggy, and mapping the fragile architecture of a child's trust. Layla trusted me in the earned way that matters. She watched where I put my attention. She tested whether my no remained no and my yes remained yes. She learned that I returned when I said I would, and that I noticed when the world tilted too suddenly. The tilt happened often in our town. You could feel it in small ways at first, the way a store clerk's smile would fade when my hand reached for a receipt, the way a teacher's question for Layla included a weight it did not include for other children. It was not thunder, it was barometric pressure dropping a degree at a time. Everyone said our community was welcoming. The brochures loved a skyline at sunset and the school district's test scores. Welcoming meant you could attend the block party and still be asked who you were visiting. Welcoming meant the PTA loved volunteer labor but never elected certain names to the board. When Layla came home with a crumpled art project because a classmate told her skin looked like the cardboard they threw away, I smoothed the paper, framed it with tape on the refrigerator, and searched for better words than the ones I wanted to say out loud. I had never met Layla's biological father until he appeared in our life like a postcard stamped with urgency. His name was Jacob. The town knew his family's property portfolio and the way city officials greeted him with first names and firm laughs. He had been gone for years, disappeared without returning calls, without birthday cards, without the strange courage it takes to apologize. But absence, I learned, can be rehabilitated when power is present. He came back wearing contrition like a tailored jacket and brought a lawyer who specialized in second chances for men whose mistakes were called youthful. He wanted time. That was the phrase. He wanted time and he wanted fairness, and he wanted to repair. The courthouse wanted schedules and signatures, the kind that ignore the time already woven into the fabric of a home. I believed in repair because I believed people could grow. I also believed in evidence. Evidence lived in Sunday pancakes, scraped knees, spelling tests, and the small, fierce hand that reached for mine at pedestrian crossings. Yet the system preferred other exhibits, pay stubs, property deeds, and affidavits formatted in the font of propriety. When my wife said Layla would be leaving to live with him, she did not look at me with anger. She looked at me with fatigue. Fatigue will bargain with anything that promises relief, even if the relief is a mirage. And our house had grown heavy with meetings and hearings, with emails that required careful tone and with the knowledge that fairness and neutrality are not synonyms. The first hearing was administrative, which is to say it hurt quietly. A temporary schedule was established. Layla would spend every other weekend in Jacob's new loft that overlooked a river the brochures loved to photograph. He arrived wearing a softness that photographed well. He had a community service record now, and a recommendation from a pastor who believed in redemption because redemption is an efficient theology in court. He had a letter from an employer about stability. Stability is a word that can be printed on letterhead, love is not. I learned a new vocabulary in those months. I learned about guardian ad litems and custody evaluators, about how credibility is a ledger that extends beyond truth. I learned that even when you do not say the quiet part out loud, the room can hear it. A caseworker described me as passionate and then lowered her voice a half step to say it again. Passionate becomes a warning when spoken like that. I listened to my tone in every email and revised until there was no music left in the words. Layla asked questions that did not have answers. She asked why the teacher who had overlooked the boy who teased her suddenly praised him for apologizing only when adults watched. She asked why the shopkeeper followed us with his eyes when we picked a birthday card. She asked why police officers waved at Jacob at the parade and did not wave at me. I gave her the history of weather systems because I did not want to teach her thunder too early. I told stories about people who built boats before rain, about the difference between fairness as an idea and fairness as a practice. The day the anonymous report arrived, 2 caseworkers stepped into our living room with laminated IDs and apologies already assembled. They asked about a bruise on Layla's shin and about whether the pantry lock was always engaged. We did not have a pantry lock. The bruise belonged to soccer. They toured the house and wrote down the brand of our smoke alarms. They left with polite faces and left behind the smell of suspicion, which lingers longer than smoke. Jacob's attorney filed motions that sounded reasonable to any listener unfamiliar with context. He argued for consistency and for minimizing transitions. He argued that his client's neighborhood had lower crime statistics, and he furnished charts. Our attorney asked whether the statistics tracked over-policing or actual safety and received a gentle reprimand for editorializing. The judge wanted facts. The judge called them facts when they arrived on glossy paper and entered evidence with indexes. At night, Nora stared at spreadsheets with expenses and snarled numbers that separated our 2 late paychecks from attorney invoices. She was not cruel. She was tired. Tired of calls that began with "as previously discussed." Tired of seeing Layla negotiate adult anxieties disguised as calendars. Sometimes, when the house slept, I sat in the hallway between our bedrooms and counted the seconds between the furnace's clicks. The body counts when it cannot control. The heart is an accountant of vanished time. Then the school sent an email about a small incident that was actually a large one. Layla had written an essay about her family. She wrote about pancakes and shoe tying and about the lullaby without words I hummed when the dog panicked during fireworks. The teacher suggested she revise the paragraphs to highlight her biological father more prominently to reflect accuracy. Accuracy became a scalpel. The principal wrote a placid note about inclusive curricula, and the next day a counselor asked if Layla felt pressure to choose sides. The question was presented as care. It functioned as a seed. The final hearing did not call itself final. It called itself a status review with recommendations. The courtroom had poorly tuned air conditioning and a row of flagpoles that hummed like tones from an old organ. The judge entered with the expression of someone who had driven through morning traffic and still carried the red lights in his shoulders. Our attorney wore a brave tie. Jacob's attorney wore a watch that looked like it told time in languages other than ours. The evaluator's report arrived in a binder with color-coded tabs. I watched the tabs even as I told myself not to. Blue for school, green for home, yellow for health, red for concerns. The red section did not contain the incident at the store or the principal's email or the time the neighbor called us late at night to say a police cruiser had parked outside our house for 20 minutes and then left without knocking. The red section contained the anonymous report, now closed as unfounded, and a paragraph about my presence at school board meetings where I had raised my voice about disciplinary disparities. The paragraph described me as passionate again, and again the word performed double duty. The judge spoke about the child's best interest, that cathedral of a phrase people enter to find pews that match their expectations. He praised both households for caring, acknowledged the mother's effort, and expressed optimism about the father's re-engagement. He cited stability and the potential for reduced conflict if Layla established a primary residence with her biological father during the school year, with meaningful, scheduled time allocated for me and for Nora. He used the word meaningful 3 times, and each time the syllables sounded like bubble wrap popping. When he finished, the room rested in the hush that follows incantation. Our attorney leaned closer to me with sentences about appeal timelines, but the numbers were climbing a staircase I could not see. Jacob's attorney shook hands with the evaluator and thanked the bailiff for professionalism. In the hall, someone's laughter echoed like glassware. At home, the suitcase opened its mouth again. Layla placed items with the disciplined movements of someone performing a ritual for the first time and already hating it. Nora moved through rooms like someone tallying ghosts. Neighbors pretended not to notice the extra bags. The dog understood more than anyone and mourned with his whole body. The drive to Jacob's building moved past the reservoir where we had taught Layla to ride a bike without training wheels. The bike had lilted toward the cattails, and she had steadied herself using her feet, laughing that breathless, surprised laughter that belongs to children who do not yet understand gravity as threat. I thought of the first scraped knee, the bandage with cartoon stars, the way she had declared herself brave afterward. In the car now, bravery settled differently. It sat beside her like a quiet passenger. We parked. The elevator carried us with the indifferent grace of machines. The hallway smelled like fresh paint and citrus cleaner. The door opened onto a view of the river the brochures loved. Jacob had staged the living room with softness, throw blankets, plants, a shelf of new books whose spines had not yet learned human hands. Papers waited on a marble island for signatures that would acknowledge receipt of schedules and codes and key fobs. My hand, trained to muffle grief for a child's sake, performed. I signed. I looked at the child. I did not speak, because promises, when broken by courts, can turn words into glass. Layla hugged me with a force that recorded itself in my ribs. She stepped back, lifted her chin in the way she did when she wanted to show she was not fragile, and then disappeared down a hallway into a room with sky-colored walls. The door closed. The soft latch echoed like a verdict becoming an address. The next morning, the house learned a new silence. The clock clicked as always, but the sound now traveled farther, seeking ears that were not there. I set out 2 bowls for cereal anyway and then put one away. The body drafts routines before the mind consents. The dog stationed himself by the door at 3 p.m., and I opened it just to let the friendly afternoon in. The air did not bring a school bus. The air brought the scent of cut grass and a faint metallic note from the neighbor's swing set. What I did next will never win any contest for dramatic flourish. I opened a document. I copied the appeal instructions line by practical line. I priced retainers and examined my bank account with the steadiness of a surgeon refusing to blame the scalpel. I wrote to teachers with careful sentences that named Layla's strengths in a way data understands: persistence, pattern recognition, kindness that improves collaborative tasks. I read about case law without the luxury of outrage. I blocked out time to record small memories before they evaporated: the salsa she liked, the corner of the couch where she read, the way she held a pencil as if it were a slender bird. I wrote these down because systems keep what is written, and I wanted my house, my head, to be a system that did not forget. Nora and I stood in the kitchen and decided something invisible but binding. We decided that love would not draft a smaller definition because a judge used a larger word called stability. We decided to refuse the false binary between fury and resignation. We would write letters and show up to games and clap at recitals whose programs listed us in the second row of acknowledgments. We would stack evidence not of ownership but of presence, because presence is the only ledger that defeats disappearance. The town did not change because our door felt larger without a small pair of shoes by it. But I noticed a different tilt in my walk. I stopped using the word fairness as a placeholder and began asking for the calibration behind the scale. When a friend at the PTA said the school was neutral, I asked how neutrality measured itself and who designed the instrument. I asked the new librarian about the section where children could find families like ours without feeling like an assignment. I learned that change resists the spotlight and prefers a stubborn lamp turned on each evening. On the second weekend, Layla returned with a backpack and a list of questions. She had new sandals and an old stare that appraises truth the way a jeweler appraises clarity. She told me about the river view and the way traffic sounds softer from 9 floors up. She told me she had started a notebook she called the real record. The first page listed ordinary things that make a day true: number of laughs, number of pages read, number of times someone listened without interrupting. She had tallied the week. She presented the totals as if they were river stones. I held them as such. I held them long enough to warm them in my palm. I do not know when the appeal will be heard or how the scales will lean. I know that history sits in the room during hearings even when no one says its name. I know that a child's trust is heavier than paper and lighter than dust and that it travels. I know that a house is a body that learns to breathe differently when a room empties and that, with time, the lungs adjust without surrendering the memory of what they once held. Betrayal, I've learned, is not always a dagger, sometimes it is a stamp on a form that misnames reality. It can arrive through exhaustion rather than malice, through polite words that mispronounce the weight of lived days. But love is a stubborn historian. It keeps the record with ink that resists weather. It tapes the art to the refrigerator and refuses to rename cardboard as something lesser than canvas. If you have ever stood at a door while the clock rehearsed certainty, you know the shape of this question: when a system declares who counts, who reminds the system how counting works? And if love has already done the arithmetic, why do we keep grading the wrong test?